I'm Joan, and this is Joan's Kitchen, and today I am doing the second recipe this month of some of my favorite Thanksgiving recipes. I'm making a dish that I call marvelous mushrooms. This is a recipe that my mother-in-law Sonya came across many years ago. I don't know where she found it. Maybe it was a newspaper article, and it's a very rich mushroom side dish. It's basically sliced mushrooms that are braised in a liquid that includes butter and some herbs and some cream. And the mushrooms are not cooked before they're put in the sauce, but they do cook down. It's baked in the oven, and it just makes a delicious sauce with the flavors of the mushroom combining with the herbs and the butter and the cream. So the ingredients in this dish are mushrooms. Today I am using a combination of white button mushrooms and baby bella, which are baby portobello, which are also the same as cremini mushrooms. These are the most commonly cultivated mushrooms that are available here in the United States. I want to stop and talk a minute about what mushrooms are. Mushrooms are actually the fruit of a fungus, and these are the mushrooms that are cultivated that are grown above ground. When you're buying mushrooms, my preference is, if possible, to buy the mushrooms that are loose in the bin rather than those that are packaged. There's a couple of reasons why. First of all, you can go through and you can choose exactly which mushrooms you want. So if you're making a dish that maybe needs bigger mushrooms, like a stuffed mushroom or something like that, you can pick through them and choose exactly the mushrooms that you want. The second thing is that when you're choosing mushrooms in the bin, and this is something that I learned from a cooking teacher many years ago, you want to look for the mushrooms that have very little stem on them, because most of you are probably going to cut off the stem and discard it anyway. So you're paying for the stems that you're going to throw out. So if you can find mushrooms that have a very short stem, that is a good thing to do. And in my personal opinion, I think that the mushrooms that are available just loose in the bin for you to pick out may be fresher than those that are in the package. I find when I bring mushrooms home from the store, if I keep them in plastic, they start to get a little bit damp and even slimy, and I find those very unappealing. And the ones that are coming in the little tubs with the plastic over them, sometimes they're already starting to get that little slimy or gooey edge to them. So that's why I prefer to choose my mushrooms that way. I did want to talk about one other way that we can get mushrooms here, and these are dried mushrooms. These are porcini mushrooms, which is an Italian variety of mushrooms. Probably the other most frequently used dried mushrooms that you would see here would be shiitake mushrooms, which are used in Chinese cooking. So when you get dried mushrooms like this, what you want to do is take some warm water and you put the mushrooms in the warm water and let them reconstitute. They will clump up, but what you need to be careful for is that a lot of time there is sand in the gill of the mushroom. So after it's softened up, you want to kind of like rub it with your fingers to make sure that you're getting the sand out of the gills, and then rinse them really well. The dried mushrooms, in my opinion, tend to have a much stronger flavor than the fresh mushrooms that we use. Mushrooms are cultivated here in the U.S. They're also cultivated in China and Poland. I don't have a lot of travel stories related to mushrooms, but the two that came to mind, one of them was at my happy place in Abruzzo, Italy, at the cooking school at Abruzzo Chivas. One year we were there in May and we went on a truffle hunt. And truffles are a different form of mushrooms. They're actually underground, and they have to have the right kind of plants to be growing, either oak trees or chestnut trees. And the spores somehow get into the ground. I think the spores may even come from the trees, and they're dug out. They look almost like little rocks. And they used to have pigs go hunting for the truffles, but the pigs, if they found the truffle, they would eat it. So now we tend to have dogs that are looking for the truffles. The dogs have a muzzle on them, but the dogs won't eat them when they find them. I do want to remind you that if you have any questions while I'm going along, please put them in the comment box, whether you're watching live or whether you're watching on the recording. The other ingredients for this dish is fresh parsley, which is going to be chopped really fine, onion or scallion. The recipe calls just for a tablespoon of minced onion. I prefer to use scallion just because they're much smaller than onions, so I don't have to open up a whole onion for just the little bit that I need for this recipe. I also really like the flavor of scallions, so that's why I'm using that. As I mentioned, this recipe is bathed in whipping cream, so we're going to have some whipping cream. The seasonings, apart from the parsley and the scallion, is Dijon mustard and just a tiny dash of nutmeg and pepper. And then we also have butter. Now the original recipe calls for the butter to be softened and the herbs and onions to be mashed into the butter. but I tried a little hack when I prepared this earlier and actually melted the butter and then mixed the ingredients into that, and it was much easier to distribute it on top of the mushrooms. And I did want to talk a little bit about the butter. This recipe calls for for a third of a cup of butter. When you have a stick of butter, it's typical for there to be measuring lines along the stick of butter. Butter you usually buy in a pound, and there's usually 4 sticks of butter in a pound, so each stick is a quarter of a pound. Each stick is also a half of a cup, it's 4 ounces, and there are lines on here, so what you're probably most used to seeing is the tablespoon lines. There's 8 tablespoons in a half a cup of butter and a stick of butter, but they also have one, so if you take 4 tablespoons or half a stick of butter, that is a quarter cup. And a third of a cup is 5 1/3 tablespoons. And this particular butter, and the other brand I've been using too, they have those measurements marked out on here. So it's marked into tablespoons, it's marked into a quarter of a cup, it's marked into a third of a cup, and the whole stick of butter is a half of a cup. And I'm trying to see if I have anything else that I wanted to mention. I did want to talk about chopping the mushrooms. The original recipe that I made earlier today, my test recipe, I sliced the mushrooms in the food processor, which in theory is fast, but if you want to retain the shape of the mushrooms, you have to stack them into the feed tube very carefully, otherwise they go in lopsided and you get kind of funky mushroom shapes. And honestly, for the amount of time that it took to stack them in there so I would get a nice mushroom shape, and the way that they came out with a lot of it almost getting shredded, I really wasn't happy with it, and it really doesn't take very long to slice mushrooms by hand. So for this recipe, the mushrooms that I'm slicing, I'm slicing them a little bit less than a quarter of an inch, about like this. So for a good medium-sized mushroom, I sliced it into about 4 pieces. And I'm going to do that with my last one here, also about 4 pieces. Oh, and I forgot to mention there is a little bit of flour that is going to be going into the sauce. So as the mushrooms are braising in the cream with the butter mixture, the flour kind of binds it together, so it comes out looking like a creamy, bubbly sauce. So I'm going to go ahead and mix my ingredients together here. I've got flour that I've already measured out. I've got my scallions here. I have my parsley that I've also minced, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. Let me move this out of the way. I have my Dijon mustard, which I've measured out. I'm going to mix that in, and I went ahead and I melted my butter, so I'm going to pour that in. And I'm going to mix this all together. And then I'm going to start layering my mushrooms into a little casserole dish. The dish doesn't have to be very big because the mushrooms are going to cook down considerably while they are in the oven. So I'm going to mix this together. So again, what's in here is chopped up, actually minced shallots, minced parsley, Dijon mustard, a little bit of flour, and the melted butter. And I'm going to add just a dash of cayenne pepper. It called for 1/8 of a teaspoon, so that really is a dash, just a very gentle shake. And the same amount of nutmeg, just to give it a little seasoning. As I mentioned before, the recipe calls for the butter to be softened and for you to mix the chives and onions and mustard into the softened butter. But this hack of melting the butter and mixing it in together just makes it a little bit easier to spread it over the mushrooms. And I need a whole cup of whipping cream, so I'm going to get that ready. As I mentioned, I've pre-chopped my mushrooms, so I'm going to layer about half of the mushrooms in my dish here. And they're going to be, in the end, kind of like heaping out of the dish, but that's okay because they're going to kind of collapse and cook down. And I'm now going to take this mixture that I have, my butter and my seasoning mixture, and I'm going to kind of just like drop it in dollops over the top of the mushrooms here. So as the mushrooms are cooking, this is going to kind of mix into the cream that they're also braising in, which is going to flavor the whole dish, along with the liquid that's coming out of the mushrooms, which is very flavorful. Whoops. And I'm going to put the rest of the mushrooms on top here. As I mentioned, it's going to be a little bit heaping here, but these will be cooking down. They're going to be baking in the oven at just about 375 degrees, and it takes just under an hour to bake these. You can prepare them in advance and reheat them just for about 15 minutes. You definitely want this dish to be served hot. So I've got my little seasoning mixture that I've kind of like portioned over there, and I'm going to top the whole thing with a cup of whipping cream. And that is going to go right into the oven. You don't need to cover it. So let me move that out of the way. And I have one that I prepared earlier. Now you can see this, where the line is in here inside of the pan, the actual level of the mushrooms is about an inch lower because they kind of like cook down and collapse upon themselves as they're cooking. It's not the most attractive dish, but it is really, really delicious. And I'm going to take a little spoon here so you can see what it looks like. So it's just basically the mushrooms almost like in a cream gravy, but the gravy is really seasoned nicely with just a little bit of parsley and the shallots that have cooked down and a little taste of mustard. It also smells amazing while it's baking. So I hope that you may give this a try. You can always transfer it into a dish that's a little bit more attractive to put on your Thanksgiving table, or maybe you've got a nice fancy dish to bake it in. I will be posting the recipe, or I'll be sharing it in my newsletter that's going out. But if you want a copy of the recipe, please just go ahead and put a comment in there for me. I think next week I'm going to be doing our family's version of stuffing. We always make a wild rice stuffing, and everybody who tries it really likes it, even if they think that they don't like wild rice. So that's my plan for next week. And then the last Monday before Thanksgiving, I'm going to be doing a dessert. It's a kind of a no-bake cheesecake that I first had in a restaurant in London, and it's the only recipe that I ever wrote away to Bon Appetit to get, and I didn't get it. But shortly after that, there was another magazine that had a recipe that I knew was really similar to the one that we had in London, and that is what I make now. It's a white chocolate cheesecake that you don't bake, and it's really delicious, and it's a beautiful dessert to add to your Thanksgiving table. So that is it for today. Ciao for now, and I will see you again next Monday from Joan's Kitchen. Have a great week, everybody.